Okay, I'm going to start again. A very warm welcome to people here and out there. And just make yourself known if there's a problem. You can't hear me properly. Okay, so let's try again. As I was saying, I have a background, among other things, in the adaptation study circuit, and around many years ago now, 15, 20 years ago, a couple of us founded the Association of Adaptation Studies. I mentioned people like Tom Leach, Camilla Elliott, Deborah Cartnell, Amanda Wheelahan, a couple of others, and I was part of that group. And probably the first work of mine that came out of that was Jane spotting was called, so Jane Austen adaptations, which was a big thing in the 1990s. Obviously, it's I think probably still going strong. So thanks for being around. Thanks for listening to me. I will be speaking about my stuff here for about 40 minutes, maybe. So bear with me, and then I'm going to hopefully leave you with a little video which will hopefully provoke discussion about my thing. And thanks again to Teresa for inviting me here and for the ability to be here for the first time actually in Brazil, first time in Rio. It's very exciting to me. If you look at the paper, it's called From Television Adaptation to Television Cloning, the Global Reformatting of the Medea Myth by Dr. Foster. And this is what basically the second part in particular of that paper. I will be looking at two media transpositions. The second part will be devoted to a particular television type of adaptation called television cloning, or reformatting, another word that's used for it. And I will take the myth, play, and character, Medea, as an example. But before this, I will begin by looking at the media transposition of the novel codename Villanelle to the television series Killing Eve. Does anybody know that right here? Killing Eve, which I will use to illustrate how adaptation works in serialized television. So, let's see if it works here. Okay. It comes out of a debate between adjacent fields, this the field of adaptation studies and the field of serialization. That's also part of that thing. I mean, one thing you notice if you're working in a field like this, which addresses things like media transpositions, I think they're very interesting relations to fields like translation studies, intermediality studies, remediation, serialization, to name but a few. So it's really interesting. We are all, in some ways, concerned with sort of cultural transfer, and serialization is interesting because it's like a long-term, in a way, like a long-term adaptation. So in that sense, it's different from transmedia storytelling. But of course, here's another field that's been developing. Transmedia storytelling is also a field one should pay attention to. So this part of the paper is really addressing this idea: adaptation versus serialization. I have for a long time championed the distinction between adapting as a cultural technique and things that existed even before there was adaptation, and the various genres where the boundaries might be useful. I think, therefore, within our field, we should distinguish between the study of adapting, which is a general cultural technique of versioning a culture. The term versioning is taken from Brian McHale. And then the narrower study of adaptation as a textual versioning. where we actually compare texts in the usual, the sort of the standard methodology of adaptation studies, which I think is a kind of comparative hermeneutics. You begin with one text, you compare it to the adapted text, and then you arrive probably a study of differences, similarities, and you discuss how far these texts are away from each other, what has been done in the exchange. That's the narrow sense of adaptation studies, but the wider sense is, for me, in a way more interesting. Like the study not of a particular adaptation, but the study of adapting, which actually tells you, I think, a lot about how cultures proliferate, how they survive, actually. So this is the original idea, of course, behind adaptation. So I hope that the examples that I'm talking about will, in a way, do both achieve some kind of textual reading of kind of comparative hermeneutics, and also look at adapting in a wider sense. So the study of both adapting and adaptation, I think, is necessarily anti-essentialist. So this is come out from the 80s. So I have post-structuralism is lurking behind them. So both serialization and adaptation, I think, are interstitial in the sense that when we study that kind of thing, and that must ring true to translation scholars as well, that you are concerned with the in-between, the interstitial area of text. So you can't just focus on a meaning that is in a text, but there's a whole range of meanings that reside not in the text, but in the discursive relations or formations between texts. So echoes here, Foucault. And I think, again, adapting might be established as a broader category removed from the product-oriented term adaptation. And what I'm aiming at is what James Nairmore has a long time ago actually described as a general theory of repetition. And this is, I think, where most of our fields come together, I think. So whether you're in translation studies or in transmedia storytelling, or in intermedia studies or inter-art studies, or serialization, you're always in a situation where you have meanings in a discursive relation rather than in a text. So in the in-between of texts. So this is in line with what my German colleague Frank Kelleter has called the realm of repetition and variation, including continuation, modification, and expansion. End of quote. It tries to bring, quote again, adaptation study from the margins to the center of contemporary media studies. So that's James Nairmore. So the idea is really sort of to expand your field and then articulate that you're at the heart of cultural work. And you're not just concerned with the latest journal stuff protection, which is fine. I mean, there's no issue with that. But I just like to think that adaptation is more productive than that. And I think the term translation has an equally productive history and future, I hope. So I'm engaging here in the future dialogue with seriality, remakes, remaking, so you're remaking transmedia storytelling, fan studies, and so forth. It's a bit controversial. In our field, at least, Linda Hutcheon has famously defined an adaptation as, and I quote, an extended, deliberate, announced revisitation of a particular work of art, end of quote. And scholars such as Cardwell have insisted that this is the heartland of adaptation studies. But I'm sure, I mean, I'm not familiar with sure that in translation studies there are similar debates on how wide you cast your net and whether you should stick to so that the classics or whether you should expand a little bit. I think expansion is always good. I think you've got to think of adaptations, as I say, less than individual text and more of a discursive network with many interventions as kind of nodes in a network that change the entire network. So it's not just like you're adapting one text, but you're adapting an entire network. Even if you're just put a piece of fan art on Etsy, it is a discursive intervention of sorts, and in a Foucauldian way, discursive formation. And this includes fan fiction. You know, people have been trying to exclude fan fiction from adaptation studies. I think you should include it as, quote, unauthorized adaptation and rewriting of media texts. That's Fatah, 2017. So there's basically one area where you have the policed borders, and I've suggested a model. So this is a simple model of adapting the realm of repetition and variation. And I'll quote. This is the first model of the general field of intermediality, intertextuality, and remaking, where we keep adaptation. That's the blue perspective here, which is kind of diagonal. So there's one discursive intervention, then there's another one at a different point in time. So X is the time axis, so Y is the medium axis. Also, it's transposition, they've changed the medium. I think in translation, more or less, I think you are intramedial, so you work with the same sort of symbolic order medium of text. Adaptations like diagonal here, and then you have that's the blue situation. You have transmedia storytelling in green, which looks at the way that various discursive interventions happen at the same time, often in the context of a franchise, where you have the board game, the computer game, the film, various versions. So this continues. And then you have the yellow part of the model, which is seriality remaking, which is sort of also staying in the same medium, but then remaking it again and again. So that would be the yellow area, remaking. And we'd like to keep these separate, but if you look at the way that we're looking at these franchises or even digital texts or adaptations, what you often do is you mix them together. And so I think the reality of our research is more like that model. It involves all sorts of interactions and cultural interventions at various points in time. I think it's important to situate these investigations then, of course, in a kind of formal study. I think there's a case here for form, something that Camilla Elliott's invested in. She has an important point here, but also, of course, reflecting various cultural moments and changes in notions of gender, for instance, intersectionality, so on. The fact of serialized adaptation enables and challenges audiences to resituate their knowledge. So this is a terminology taken from Donna Haraway. And so the first part of this paper is really about how watching Killing Eve is different if you have a long-term reception process and a long-term production process. Then this accounts for various differences. So it's about watching Killing Eve after COVID and after wars that are going on in the world, after the Extinction Rebellion, war in Ukraine, all of these things. And so this kind of context changes, and we call it the context is the textual recursivity and proliferation of texts. So serializations invite various fan interactions, while they're, according to Kellett, evolving narratives. That's the important thing about serialization. Evolving narratives, and therefore subject to realignment, continuous realignment. So you can observe this in the case of Killing Eve very well if you look at the print versions by a guy called Jennings, who you probably don't know, who wrote the original series of texts. It's self-published on the web, like in a self-produced, and then it suddenly turned into a large franchise. As Kellett argues, series tend to proliferate both in terms of canon and fanon, to introduce this fan studies distinction, and they are actor networks in which we, as we see in Killing Eve, the tulle dress, which you can see here, Jodie Comer in the tulle dress can become an important agent in the way that fans engage with this series. It has become an important agent. It's like an iconic image for the one episode where it actually appeared. And in a few minutes, you could see it on the screen. And so finally, the series co-evolved with their cultural environment. In our case, first produced pre-COVID, then post-COVID, pre-Brexit, post-Brexit, another context that's interesting, I think, pre-Extinction Rebellion, post-Extinction Rebellion, and so forth. That's, I think, in Killing Eve's it's particularly interesting because it's about Europe. There's a lot of European stuff and then cultural stuff, political stuff, and so on. So Kellett has, in 2017, called these evolving narratives because they exist as entities that keep developing in adaptive feedback with their own effects. So here's then, gradually these models get more complicated. And I know it's awful and it's really cluttered at the end, but it will get more complicated. So that's the first network of killing leaf. It starts up there in blue. So that the blue line is, remember, that's the translation aspect. Sorry, that's the adaptation aspect. So that's the first recursive network of Killing Eve. It starts with this really mediocre self-published set of print text or digital text, actually, codenamed Villanelle, which appeared in 2014, 36 pages, so not a massive novel. Published in Kindle singles as a mini book. So that's really the beginning of that. And then it develops. It develops particularly with the first series of Killing Eve. Naturally, if you have a look at the things here, the adapted and streamed television, the first cross here in the yellow line. We have Killing Eve 1, and that's because basically Phoebe Waller-Bridge became interested in the text, and then it took off from there. So you have people with clout in the business hearing it, and they developed it. And then, of course, this has an impact again on the series of texts. They are republished, and when you republish, you take some screenshot, some screen grab from Killing Eve, and then you republish for the Villanelle, and so on. So the fourth series then appeared finally, and there's an interesting case always in seriality. There's both diminishing critical appreciation and also diminishing numbers in terms of viewer engagement. You see that in Killing Eve, fourth series with not so well received finally. And then you have like the green line where you have a developing fandom with unauthorized adaptations, a lot of material stuff there, and these discursive, another important area of discursive interventions. So ultimately, this complex web is what a typical adaptation is these days. And there's another thing I mentioned, it involves so crucial shifts of global politics, economic culture, and so forth, with fascinating recursive impact on the canon. Just to give you an example, in Killing Eve, you will remember this takes place all over Europe, and both Villanelle and Eve and all the other characters, they're flying across Europe at an alarming rate. So she appears, every other day she's in another metropolis. She's in Moscow, she's in Prague, etc. And this day and age of flight chain, and a colleague of mine has actually published a paper on the idea of flight travel without any thought of the footprint that you leave, etc. So it's sort of like riffing on James Bond. It riffs on the ready availability of travel in a particular, of course, social setup. So the three series of Killing Eve were produced and disseminated immediately before COVID-19 and Brexit, and the new awareness of the climate crisis. And in hindsight, we can then notice an epistemic shift that my contention will resituate the emerging knowledge about Killing Eve, and also influences the adaptation while it is being adapted. That's a fun thing about serialized adaptations, that you can actually monitor how people are responding. It's done on a regular basis, obviously, and then you can change it while you're at it. So that's my first example. My second example is another case of longitudinal adaptation. That's Medea. I don't know how familiar you are with the Medea myth, a character from Greek literature. Probably the most important discursive intervention there is Euripides' tragedy, dating from the 5th century BCE. But there also, even the beginning, this is like an adapted text. So there's no definitive versions. There's a variety that stories that make up the entire myth. Medea is married to Jason, who abandons her for King Creon's daughter, variously called Creusa or Glauce. And Medea and her sons by Jason are to be banished from Corinth. In revenge, she murders Creusa with poisoned gifts, a dress, and gold coronet. After the death of Jason, she murders her own two sons before fleeing to Athens, a woman taking brutal revenge for her betrayal. Even that skeleton of the story tells you that it can be antagonizing and controversial. So it's a very special kind of myth here. So the second part of the paper asks the question of how such a very old story is being told and adapted in the context of digital television. And I think the case is indicative of global trends in transcultural adaptation across transnational SVOD services. So that's subscription video on demand, SVOD, on Netflix, which is the more common name. And of course, there are rivals. There's Hulu, there's Disney Plus. In 2015, British playwright Mike Bartlett, best known for his work in the theatre, adapted Medea. Adapted it in the theatre and then adapted it for British television. It was produced by Drama Republic, garnered the BAFTA award for Suran Jones, the lead actress. And the first season proved to be a hit with UK audiences and spawned the second series in 2017 with a finale. Watched by 9.8 million viewers. That's a 40% audience share, quite remarkable. Subsequently, Dr. Foster became a global phenomenon as it was remade in a variety of surprisingly diverse cultural milieus. This slide actually means it shows you the diversity that we already have in the Medea story. So it's like a globally circulated narrative that can be mapped on many concerns, actually, that can serve so many purposes. So, too close. So let's look at these localized versions. In my title, Medea is not very happy about these localized versions. I think she's insisting on some kind of essence to a narrative. That's why she's looking so grumpy. Anyhow, so these are localized TV adaptations. It's a case of franchise diversification and expansion that gave new traction to the tradition of, and these are the terms: program adaptation by Keenan Moran. And it has been dubbed TV formatting or TV cloning. It's not a new phenomenon. As early as 21st century precursors predate the road of television streaming, or what Amanda Lotz has called internet distributed television. The diversified world of platform TV seems ideally suited to the practice of TV cloning. So there's been a lot of that. According to Michael Keane and Albert Moran, the format is the total package of information and know-how that increases the adaptability of a program in another time and place. Possession of the format enables producers to grant licenses and then enforce copyright. So whatever you do with Dr. Foster, you can copyright your BBC. The context for this study is that seeks to address both emerging textualities and practices of these digitally transformed TV industries. It's the fluid redistribution of television consumption zones across the planet. So for me, that's really interesting. The consumption zones. My consumption zone is Germany mostly, and probably television has a long history as a national. In the old days of terrestrial television, we had a clearly defined national field of reception and audiences. And in a way, I think this is still the case, in spite of Netflix. So in terms of an adaptation sequence, the Greek Medea myth currently reaches audiences as its television adaptation Dr. Foster and its global reformatted clones. The internet-based television world includes online TV portals that often seek to re-articulate the boundaries of these national consumption zones. Examples include the license fee-based iPlayer in the UK. For instance, I can't get iPlayer in Germany. It's restricted. There are ways of tweaking that a little bit. I'm interested in the situation in Brazil, whether there's a kind of national dimension to that in any kind of way. That is also, so it restricts access to cultural material. So these TV portals often seek to re-articulate the boundaries of national consumption zones. So iPlayer in the UK, and the subscription video on demand platforms, Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu, that often have these national variations with creating a great demand. You're probably aware of that. And I'm sure there's been studied in the translation studies circuit of these subtitling, intertitling, dubbing practices that enable, on the one hand, you have restricted consumption zones. On the other hand, of course, you need to get across these consumption zones if you want to expand your franchise. Transactional video on demand, so that will be iTunes, increasingly hybrid video portals such as YouTube, which is advertising driven, so AVOD, advertising driven video on demand. The result is a hybrid and constantly evolving world of platforms, and I'm drawing on the work of Roman Lobato here, that, quote, aggregate content from various sources, further blurring the line between distributors, aggregators, channels, and hardware providers. So I think there's a good case here of initiating something that we might want to call platform studies, or interface studies, things like that. What's particularly fascinating about studying cases such as Medea or Dr. Foster reformatted for audiences in, I don't know, Turkey, South Korea, Philippines, is that they offer glimpses of what has been called local modernity. And I always think also of the term, that the time-honored term called localization, that a guy called Robertson came up in the 1990s, 1992. The idea of localization is still very much alive, but also changing right now. So I'm interested in this kind of local modernity. That is hybrid interstitial versioning of an adapted Western modernity. Medea is like a Western myth, isn't it? That's also then sort of bounces back. You see how the South Korean version of Dr. Foster, in a way, is more influential in some areas than the original Dr. Foster. So a hybrid interstitial versioning of an adapted Western modernity that has been reversed. Cases in point are many, the planned Parasite adaptation as an HBO series. I don't know about that one, whether that's still in production or something. I haven't seen it around. You can tell me more about that. So the movie Parasite, that is not being branded as a remake. You might call it a remake or like a reboot. And in the case of cannibalization, the American Netflix remake of its own South Korean action hit Time to Hunt. So these are two Netflix productions. One is the South Korean, the other one is an American. There are lots of cases in Europe, the cloning of the Spanish La Casa de Papel, the heist narrative first produced for Spanish broadcast television and subsequently acquired by Netflix, which has aired as a Korean adaptation as well. While still a powerful distribution pattern, the unidirectional west-to-west, that's the old days, west-to-west content flow of global television has been broken. I don't know, then there's many previous examples of that. I think of the history of the telenovela, which is also interesting from way back when, 30 years ago. So again, rather than unilinear transfers, which imply acculturation and assimilation, or the cultural coexistence, a multicultural situation, or exchange, intercultural situation, the transcultural processes work both ways and stress transgression and transformation. And that's something I'm still working on. To what extent do we have transgressions and transformations, or whether you have like a renationalization and rehomogenization of these products? So I think I haven't reached the final conclusion. Indeed, the study of adaptation for appropriation is central to transcultural situations of globalization and migration, exposing not only the fault lines between, but also within cultures. While a sizable chunk of globally circulating shows with a transcultural appeal continue to be of Anglo-American provenience, there have been many examples of particularly Asian series that have done well internationally. The Untamed, Alice in Borderland, Squid Game, obviously, Kingdom, Sacred Games, in various genres, of course, zombie narratives and so on. And also some European examples. Countries such as India, for instance, with a strong and powerful national media industry, and China with a complex regulation of the media, do not need the quota regime. In the old days, I think in France, there was, probably Germany too, there was a kind of quota for national products to fend off the American domination. That's more or less gone, I think. Of course, there's still the idea you have to protect your local markets against foreign content. And that'd be an interesting situation. What we can see is that the practice of cloning, reformatting, and adapting television for diverse transnational market while predating the arrival of streaming platform has been part of the Netflix DNA from the very beginning. Again, Juan Lobato. Juan Lobato defines platforms tentatively and vaguely as, quote, large-scale online systems premised on user interaction and user-generated content. So Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, also Netflix, albeit less open, social, or collaborative, that's Lobato. In addition, platforms rely on a complex set of media infrastructures now covered by what's been called infrastructure studies. So we can conceive of Netflix and other video on demand services as these gigantic localizing adaptation machines. They are themselves as hybrid as their products and need to adapt and translate to the diverging cultural, social, and regulatory milieus in which they emerge. Thus, Netflix has licensed the cornucopia of non-US content, produced series for national diverse markets across boundaries of language, currency, and cultures. We're all aware of the fluidity of the various SVOD catalogs on Netflix. It's less well known how Netflix and its rivals process their accumulated audience and user data that drives their strategic decisions, something we don't know much about. As Lobato has argued that there are Netflixes rather than just one Netflix, he points out that Netflix invests enormous amounts of money into, quote, the unavoidable labor of localization. And I think that's where translation comes in. Still being done by humans, mostly, I think. Although I think that's changing rapidly. ChatGPT and so on. Adapting, translating, subtitling, dubbing content, also interfaces, catalogs, billing services, etc. These need to be taken into account. In this way, the cloning of television formats, according to the diverging requirements of various local markets, is just one aspect of the transnational adaptation labors of global TV players. In my view, the present case study reinforces the idea that adaptation studies has to take into account platform studies, paying attention to both the structured mediation of content and what repercussions this has on the content itself. So I would briefly like to list these. So this is how we start. This is Dr. Foster as it originally emerged. And I'd like to focus a little bit here on the central role of Medea turned medical doctor, which is the standard thing. So Medea is a witch in the traditional Greek myth, but then she becomes a wealthy, well-to-do, very competent medical doctor in this format. And here's the world of the married, which is maybe the most significant one of these clones, which was shown from March to May 2020. But there are more. There's the latest one is a German one, which I did not have time to include, which is interesting. But it's available now on the public service television platforms that we have. If you're interested, check this out as well. I don't know whether you can actually get it in. Yeah? So anyhow, sometimes it's geo-blocked, obviously. Our approach to the global circulation of the Medea myth through Dr. Foster reformatted, remade, and localized is to examine the appeal of the series for program adaptation and then look at how the influential South Korean reformatting is then localized. So this second question is probably, it's a larger scale of question, and it's difficult. And it's difficult also because I don't really have access to all of these global instances. I haven't seen many of them. So here's the Belgian one that was pretty early, 2019. Infidel, Unfaithful. There's the Russian one, which is called Tell Truth, Where Truth Lies, and even the titles. This is where you can begin with your interpretation. Why has it been retitled? Why is the focus different? Where's Dr. Foster's really the idea of Dr. Foster? We'll talk about that. I think is the same. Dr. Foster went to Gloucester. This is in there. The the profession of Dr. Foster's in there, and it's not gender specific. So you think Dr. Foster could be a guy, right? Whereas the world of the married focuses very much on marriage as an institution. So very, very interesting. So where truth lies, the Russian one, there's Out of Love, India. I will show you the promotional material here. We have Saraktish, Unfaithful. A Turkish student of mine did a study of that, which I thought was very interesting because something I know very little about. It was the Broken Marriage Vow, Philippines 2022. There's the Indonesian one. It's most recent, I think, and a Thai version of that. So the BBC has been very, very successful. Here's the German one, ein Schritt zum Abgrund, a step forward to the precipice. That's how you translate it. Very successful in selling this format. So it's obvious that in order to travel to diverse audiences, the supposedly global and universal myth of Medea. So that's a good starting point. You take a universal myth, then it has to pass various thresholds. The reformatted Medea myth within the Dr. Foster franchise serves to overcome what Lobato has termed, quote, the stubborn locality of taste. So you couldn't just take the German version and then inflict it on Brazilian audiences. Maybe the dubbed versions. Is it dubbing or subtitle? What's the standard thing? Is it subtitling? Dubbing? Yeah, Brazil. Both of standard practices. So I don't think that would work very, very well. So what you have to do is you have to Brazilize, is that the term? In a way, and I think that would work beautifully. And that's because there is a stubborn locality of taste in Lobato. He argues that Netflix's, quote, Netflix's localization strategy and its commitment to new original production in multiple languages underscore the fundamentally local nature of global taste. So the global taste, but then also a local nature of that global taste. Localization in a very interesting way. Arguably, the secret of Medea's adaptability, to introduce that term, lies in the multifaceted central character, whose various guises can be activated in diverse ways. Extensive research has established that Medea is adaptation-friendly and has generated global modernization and actualization of great diversity. As a multi-narrative myth beyond the most influential version by Euripides, Medea is a pliable narrative. As Van Zyl-Smit argues, the central character, quote, can be made to represent not only betrayed women, but also oppressed racial groups, exploited colonials, and women. Adaptation to television melodrama in the BBC miniseries and its clones, we argue. So I've written this paper with a Korean colleague, Hyewon Park, who sort of had all the knowledge about Korean side of that, which I don't know much about, because I've been just once to Korea, etc. So it's a co-written paper, actually, that's just been published. If you're interested, you can check it out in adaptation. The journal. So I think it came out last month. Adaptation to TV melodrama in the BBC miniseries and its clones, we argue, provides a less confrontational, screen-friendly version of the challenging and disturbing Greek tragedy, a kind of Medea light. Dr. Foster and its remake clones invariably narrow the perspective in private gender relations. The eponymous character is a successful, professional woman seeking to balance her work and family identities and at pains to do justice to a son. Her property developer husband, terrible character. Her role as senior community GP, so that's a British context, general practitioner, and a comfortable suburban home and cars. Any cars, 2 cars, minimum. The authoritative female physician seemed an appropriate middle-class adaptation of the princess sorceress of antiquity for contemporary television audience. Now, as we shall see, there is some variation in the social milieus, but the general idea that here is a wealthy, upper middle-class representation is largely intact. So while the idea of a territorial fight with Jason, or Simon, as he's called in Dr. Foster, that's the Jason character, who represents the local community of the fictional Parminster, is retained. So that's this idea of Corinth is there in Parminster. Concept of a central ethnic divide between Bartlett's Medea character with this version of Corinth is toned down a little bit. Just as in Euripides' play based on the myth, Bartlett's Dr. Foster is prone to readings that complain of misogynist essentialism. So Medea can be portrayed as hysterical, revengeful woman governed by her passions in Greek thumos, as well as readings highlighting her feminist potentiality, an empowered woman fighting back against patriarchal dominance represented by Jason, and avoiding harmful revenge action. Because this Medea is very mindful of children, son in particular, and unlike her husband, largely stops short of physical violence. She doesn't really, she's a little bit violent at times, but largely not. Bartlett's title also mentioned the series quotes from Congreve's 1697 restoration comedy, The Mourning Bride. Quote, heaven has no rage like love to hate returned. No hell, nor hell a fury like a woman scorned, which was then translated into the proverb, hell has no fury like a woman scorned. This puts Medea, or our character here, Gemma Foster, center stage, alluding to the character's conformity to time-worn female tropes, cliches, and stereotypes. Bartlett's Dr. Foster, however, clearly has reworked Medea to make her more compatible to post-feminist modernity, indicating the reduced transgressive potential of this bourgeois divorcee. Medea, her worst secret is postnatal depression that caused her to wish for her son's death. So she does have the wish occasionally. This generic framing, she kills neither her own son nor Jason, Simon's, or Crusa's child Amanda. The new title hides Medea's credentials for the television audiences, which raises the question Linda Hutchin fundamentally asked about intertextual derivations. Are they experienced as adaptations of a classic if they're not signposted as such? An interesting point here made by the writer, Mike Bartlett. He said, in the original pitch, I never actually said, we're going to do Medea at 9 p.m. on BBC One, because it probably wouldn't have gone down very well. So the idea was always behind it. It's really important. So Medea is like the secret, the dirty secret. What Bartlett articulates about the conception of Dr. Foster presupposes three significant aspects of the adaptation. First, an unadapted Medea would alienate audiences. So like, the Greek Medea, that wouldn't have worked at all, I think. That he thought of the show as a generic mix, which also, but not only, involves motives of the classic Western myth, revenge and so on. That's what classic Western myth, revenge and so on. And third, that he's in line with feminist readings of Medea that have stripped the character of the moral extremities inherent in Greek tragedy. Quote, quote, I wanted to take some of those misogynist ideas about mad women and witches and hopefully subvert them. I get upset when people describe Gemma as mad. I don't think she is. She's just very angry. If it was a man behaving like that, you wouldn't say he was mad. You'd say he was fighting back. End quote. If approached without paratextual or contextual signposting, the title Dr. Foster, as I mentioned, is not gender specific, suggesting a male role, and maybe Dr. Faustus, even, as in the proverbial devil Dr. Foster. The title, therefore, highlights the professional role of the titular character rather than her sex. This fact contributes to the intended aim to counterbalance essentialist female stereotypes lurking in the mythical narrative. And there are really few redeeming qualities of the Jason character, Simon, who appears as weak, mendacious, testosterone-driven version of masculinity, echoing almost all of the male side characters. Finally, after two failed suicide attempts in season 2, yes, he has those. He's still alive, but even more of a wrecked victim than Medea herself, while his son Tom escapes this dysfunctional menage a trois, or even into the unknown. That's how it ends. He just walks off, probably having a third season in mind that never materialized, so he's still out there in the unknown. It's very interesting. Deliberately tying the script to the classical myth, Bartlett invokes this concept for Dr. Foster, the trope of the wronged woman. The woman as victim in a patriarchal world, but also the woman all in there as an irrational, scheming, and manipulative underneath the professional cool. Gemma Foster gestures towards becoming a reformed mother in her violent transactions with her son. She takes the transgressive bite out of the radical and disturbing actions of Medea. Bartlett tones down the excess of Greek tragedy, makes the sex war story acceptable for a recognizable presentation of a relatable female predicament of less barbarian but more civilized society, which have not yet achieved real gender equality. In the infidelity melodrama, this respected fostering community doctor, Medea, is far from a barbarian witch. She does not kill children, neither does she murder Crusoe, Glauci, the rival, or her father. Kate, Barclay's Crusoe, played by Jodie Comer, inevitably comes to share and even bond with Dr. Foster. There have been more radical feminist reworkings of Medea on stage, such as Jackie Crosland's Collateral Damage in 1991. And in addition, the soap opera credentials of the excellent lead actor, Suran Jones, might have intensified the criticism level at Bartlett's stage version that he had diluted the myth, watered Medea down to, quote, a middle-class soap opera with a grisly climax. That's the quote from one of the critical responses. Therefore, we can follow Liapes and Sidiropoulou and conclude that, quote, modern reworkings of classical myth presuppose and build on the notion of authoritativeness in order to negotiate and negate the very idea of a monumentalized manifestation of the classic and the concomitant notions of semantic fixity and originary meaning. So Dr. Foster declassicizes Medea, transmitted on the brink of the emerging Me Too movement, 2017. Medea, Dr. Foster seems to resonate particularly well in territories where formerly strictly patriarchal social structures and family relations are in the process of falling apart, but that are also vulnerable to an anti-feminist backlash. That's a bit tricky, actually, but just think that France is so different from Germany, for starters. France, Germany, Turkey, South Korea, India, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, all very different, very culturally specific, but on somehow they must also be similar for the formula to work. Focusing solely on a central heterosexual love triangle, the portrayals of the two jealous women, one older, one younger, competing for an adulterous man, husband, can easily cater to gender essentialism prevalent in most more conservative audience segments. So it does work with conservative audiences. At the same time, by concentrating on a strong, powerful, successful, financially independent woman, the series are tailored to the global set of urban middle classes that seek to redefine gender relations and are hungry for localized versions of upwardly mobile women who respond assertively or even aggressively to patriarchal victimization. Differences in how the Medea scenario is processed are discussed by André Reynaud, I love that title, he's Senior Vice President Global Format Sales at BBC Studios. So he's basically the guy who sells the stuff. He reveals that there are diverse paths to cloning of Dr. Foster. The India version was suggested by a team at BBC Studios India, pitching it to Disney Hotstar, whereas the French, TF1, the French company, directly approached the BBC and said, we want this, suggesting that cultural borders between the UK and France are maybe less pronounced than, for instance, India, where you had to actually explain, this is how it works, this is how you can see that as an India clone. Renault reports that he never thought of Dr. Foster format might actually travel to countries as diverse as Russia, India, or France, or Germany, Philippines, and so on, but concludes on the transcultural appeal of infidelity, treachery, and revenge. These are universal things, obviously. He comments in interesting ways on his dual responsibility. This is how translation scholars know this. I mean, you certainly have a responsibility to the text you're translating. That's your key responsibility, isn't it? Or ultimately, always. But the dual responsibility to the original format and the target markets. He articulates his trust in the appeal of the Medea narrative across cultural boundaries, arguing that, quote, the core premise can easily travel between different territories. He also insists that there is continuing interest in Dr. Foster as a showcase to decidedly local culture, adding that it is then the responsibility of the region that has commissioned the show to add the level of culture to make it relatable to the specific region. End of quote. Dr. Foster reflects the negotiation of local and global aspects of distribution in the wake of global TV cloning and reformatting among Netflix nations. That's the title of Lobato's study. Having established why the Medea myth is a suitable vehicle for contemporary television, I now investigate a little bit the special relevance of the Medea myth in local adaptations for societies in the crucial phase of cultural transformation, here particularly in particular the redefinition of social roles for women in Russia, Turkey, South Korea, Indonesia, Philippines. The list of remakes suggests that the show has traveled easily to the east. We would expect particularly the Asian Eastern shows to differ from the parent program Dr. Foster's Western versions of gender relations and family patterns, replacing them with localized versions, adapted modernity that is more in line with the respective culturally, socially, and politically acceptable scenarios. First, we need to acknowledge the influence of successful earlier remakes in spreading the format. For instance, the 2022 Philippine version, The Broken Marriage Vow, emerged largely from the success of the Korean remake, The World of the Married. So it adapts The World of the Married rather than Dr. Foster. Because that one proved wildly successful with Philippine viewers when it was shown in the Philippines, generating a large and loyal audience for the South Korean one. And second, localization is central. In the case of the Philippine adaptation, a publicity article citing director Colin Macchino highlights the efforts at localization, stressing fashion elements, a stylish barong, and promising that, quote, it will integrate Filipino elements in the story from the setting, the food, the style of life. The Indian, Out of Love, is a remake or clone that replicates the English upper middle class world beyond the inner cities, set in the lush green meadows of the Kunur in Tamil Nadu. A review in the Hindustan Times praises this portrayal of strong femininity, but also criticizes its lack of originality. Quote, if you've watched Dr. Foster, it's unsettling to see the story following the original scene by scene, and actors giving takes expression by expression. We'll see that in a second. Andre Renaud has commented on the cultural changes necessitated by the Indian version. Quote, in India, for example, the character of the mother-in-law is now in the house and therefore builds on the family dynamic and the pressure that Noora Kapoor, as she's known in this version, is facing on a journey. So the living arrangement is slightly different. In Korea, The World of the Married presents a prime example of transcultural program adaptation and cloning, reworking Dr. Foster for new audiences, a different social media setting, and a new ethnic culture. This cultural and spatial relocation necessitated various plot alterations and additions in order to cement its place within the local marital infidelity genre. So there is a South Korean genre where it fits in nicely, and that's like a template, a new template for this old story. The various cultural diversions and extra subplots were generally preserved, but you probably, South Korean audiences would probably more respond that much more to this than I can do. I mean, for instance, there's like this women's club that meets regularly and that clearly so polices the borders of how you can behave, how you can act, establish the social norm. And that's a thing in South Korea. And it's you can map on that and use it for your version. It has nothing to do with Medea, but feeds into it. In conclusion, the reformatting and cloning of television series while operating in the same digitally formatted, differentiated abundance that's created remix culture and also raising similar issues of intellectual property, copyright, and ownership. It's a tightly controlled and calculated program adaptation. And that's vastly different from, remix, the appropriative bricolage often discussed as remix or mashup, things like that. Netflix and other video on demand services are adaptation machines that routinely platform adaptive operations, remixing existing format with local generic formula. The adaptive operations that make Medea palatable for local modernity are first modernizing and sanitizing the Medea myth into a transculturally appealing thriller that easily fits into recognizable feasible social patterns of heterosexual infidelity and revenge within the realistic aesthetics of domestic teen drama. For instance, can you have homosexual characters in it, gay characters? You can in some areas, you can't in others. So this is something that's going to change. The best friend, Medea's best friend, Dr. Foster, is gay. That would work in Korea, for instance. So that's not the case there. And secondly, diversifying and localizing the cultural scenarios within this affluent, globalized modernity so that they become palatable to the targeted affluent lifestyles of middle-class audiences across social, ethnic, and national barriers. And I'd like to end on a little clip. This is like 2 or 3 minutes. Some guy, sometimes you have you have examples. You always introduce this by some guy has put it on YouTube. And this is like a supercut of 4 versions, and it's always the dinner party scene. And what this illustrates is to what extent this is cloned. If you see the gestures of the actors are sometimes they're just copied, basically. But then there's also difference, and I don't trust the subtitles so much, as you likely shouldn't, I think. But it's interesting. If you can monitor when you watch that, whether you actually know where we're now transitioning, receding into the next thing. So that's the dinner party scene, where sort of the secret is explained to all concerned, and the husband is there, the unfaithful husband, and his new love interest, and the father and mother. So it's like a family invitation, and then she spills the beans, basically. And so here you have the Turkish version, the South Korean version, the Philippine version mixed together, and the original version. And I hope it works technically. Nope, it's the wrong one. Oh no. Sorry.
Susie, you'll notice that Kate looks quite unhappy.
It's okay.
You're a fucking bitch. Bitch is right. And I'm a wolf tonight.
Kocam beni aldatıyor. O yüzden.
남편 때문에요. 바람 폈거든요, 이 사람.
Taon na ako niloloko ng asawa ko at ng kabit niya.
Sorry, Susie, but your daughter's not a little girl anymore. You can ask my husband. He likes blowjobs, apparently. And I'm told she really knows what she's doing. No, there's more. No!
2 senedir başka bir kadınla yatıyormuş. Daha doğrusu genç bir kızla. Sizin kızınızla.
임신한 거 부모님은 아직 모르시나 봐, 다경 씨.
Mr. and Mrs. Rosero, your daughter is sleeping with my husband.
Enough! No. I've heard enough.
Hindi pa to enough. Kasi may isa pa kayong kailangang malaman.
What you dare say?
Kate got pregnant with Simon's child. And because he messed her around so much, she had it aborted.
Kocamın projesine yatırım yapmıştınız değil mi? Tabii. Nereden bileceksiniz evli ve çocuklu bir adamın kızınızla da yattığını?
이댁 따님이요. 내 남편이랑 바람 펴서 임신했다고요. 회장님은 그것도 모르고 거액을 투자하신 거고요.
Nabuntis ni David ang anak ninyo at pumunta siya ng Amerika para ipa-abort ang bata.
What?
Size bir haber daha vereyim. Kızınız kocamdan hamile.
sus artık! Sus! Sus!
남의 남편은 건드리는 게 아니다. 아이까지는 유부남한테 함부로 껄떡대면 안 된다. 암만 몸이 달았어도 남의 가정 파탄내는 건 나쁜 년들이나 하는 짓이다. 미친다!
Afiyet olsun.
Atılan kadının öfkesi cehennem ateşinden beterdir.
I never trusted you!
Okay, I think that's a good moment to end on, and we can discuss now how the production codes are cloned, the gestures of the actors are cloned, etc., and stuff like that. Thanks for your attention.
The Turkish version is like a reality show.
I don't,
Mix of a telenovela, soap opera, and a reality show.
yeah, I mean, from what I've learned from the South Korean version is that in all likelihood that they're taking existing television formulae and adapt it to those existing formulae, so that you have recognizable visuality and production values and so on. And that's what I find interesting, that you have that kind of adaptation to the probably Turkish ones as well. But it's still the same story as cloned. So they try very cleverly, I think, to integrate the universality of the story and the very sort of this really localization you need for it to work. So, and that's only possible if you have like a similar like social structure where, you know, these are people that come close to your audience, and they would probably realize, yeah, that's very local. At the same time, it's universal. And I think it's also important, of course, that you have an audience who would use those platforms and you know, have the subscriptions, depending on whether that's, so some still use the old models of even public service television. The German version is public service television, but the entertainment branch of those, of course, they also adapt to existing formulae. They're now trying to copy Netflix production values. Yeah, also use the same platform distribution. Yeah, close to the precipice, close to the edge in a way, nah am Abgrund, which basically, you know, I think alludes to the disintegrating family and also maybe the identity. The idea is close to the edge, etc. So the focus here is on the extreme emotional situation she's in.
How even the actress, the main character, how she's dressed in each very different.
Yes.
It's very proper to how middle class is portrayed in Korea. You mentioned this sort of women's club. It's for control in Korean dramas. And it's actually something that we don't see in other cultures. And very interested to watch it. I'm thinking now of the parallels that you mentioned between the original and the Boston and aspects of British culture or Western culture, and how this is adapted or cloned to the Korean culture, which I study and realize, and how they adapted all these aspects.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Maybe translate that for the people, because I don't know whether they actually heard the question. The question was about the cultural specificity in for instance, the dresses, how that is probably signifying middle class, the upper middle class, even across various national cultural divides. And then so you have to use it wrong in one version, and then business attire, different business attire in others. And also, which I mentioned in passing, like these women's clubs that exist in South Korea is culturally specific. Whereas, for instance, here's two examples. I talked about your gay characters. To what extent can they play a role in that society to make it plausible? The other thing is, for instance, that best friend of the general practitioner, the GP, Gemma Foster, in the English version, is a teacher. And so my colleague told me that this is a no-no in South Korea. It wouldn't happen because the social status of a teacher is so much below the social status of a successful doctor that they would never mix socially. So this is something you have to deal with if you want to make that acceptable to your audience. So as a kind of representation. And then, of course, you could argue, is it a representation of the real life, or is it a representation of the conventions for that kind of generic format, which is more important maybe than to have it adapted to real life? I think you need to adapt to the generic format. And then also watching this again, this gesture of removing your hair, sort of in this final sequence of triumph, quiet triumph, in close-up, etc. That's universal, but it's also culture specific. So you have to decide then whether in your culture there would be a gesture that people would be making, indicating, of course, and then you take the napkin, finished with these people now, and like it has this interesting. We have to decide whether it's culturally plausible in your target, with your target. Thanks for the question.
The growing stories here in Latin America, I think in all the world nowadays. And to this point, I wonder what is universal, what is the link that connects us with this so ancient stories like India. And for example, at some point you said that experiences like betrayal or infidelity are universal, but I think about some indigenous teachings here in Amazon, like that, where there are other arrangements, and how to connect to this knowledge with this, I don't know if I'm getting it.
So the question, if I try to paraphrase and see, you can see whether it's correct. The question was about the diversity of sort of gender arrangements, etc. I mean, what is like universalized here is like what they call the nuclear family. Like, we have two kids or one kid, mother, father, heterosexual, etc. Of course, I mean, you can imagine other arrangements, polyamorous, you name it, and these are not represented. I think they do exist in various sort of cultural kinds of cultural visibility, but this is kind of narrowed down to the predominant upper middle class format, where you could say, this is how these people live. It easily translates into something that's recognizable. And so that the revenge pattern unfolds then along these lines. And of course, Gemma Foster is a much better position than Medea because she has the means to not kill anyone, not even hit anyone. She doesn't resort to physical violence. Jodie Comer resorts to violence here. She's in a less powerful position. She can just leave her husband. He's in financial trouble. She's the breadwinner mostly, and so she can afford to lose him easily, sort of be happier for it, etc. Of course, in spite of all the emotional turmoil results, obviously, a situation for the kid, etc. Because this is why it's Medea light. So the kind of extremity of the destructiveness of killing, etc. This is taken on, and you might say this is an indication of a more equal social formation between men and women, basically. But still, you have to watch out for the conservative audiences. So that's for her, for the actress. I think it's really difficult to this dividing line between extreme behavior, really angry, vindictive, even, and also controlled and from a position of power. That's really interesting. Also, the question what does that do to male audiences? I don't think it's designed for male audiences necessarily, but it should also work with them.
Studies, for example, we talk a lot about revisiting the myths and use the language to fight the dominant values. And I'm wondering now how to do this with these other arrangements of civilizations around the world, because this is a very Western culture, and I think, I don't know if it's, but I'm very immersed in other type of discussions nowadays, the African studies, for example, or here the indigenous cultures, etc. So, how to keep a link?
Yeah. So basically, I think that translate that question into, what would you have to do for this story to work in yet other kinds of cultural scenarios? That's interesting.
Without destroying,
without destroying the sort of the skeleton of the Medea thing, then you can say, okay, revenge. Being scorned, infidelity. I mean, infidelity is culturally determined, isn't it, to some extent? You can imagine. But dominantly, it seems to translate globally. But you can imagine societies where people would think, what's the issue, basically? I don't know. But that is why it's so interesting. You exactly pinpoint.
Adaptation.
Yes, this is why I'm in this circle, because it's like a register of cultural difference.
Oh, thank you for your talk. Very interesting. And about the concept, the notion of cloning. Can we say that it's cloning when a foreign film is adapted by a different culture, as the American film industry does so often?
That's a good question. I think it's probably a bit of a misnomer, cloning, because it seems to be completely identical as a clone. And you could see why they've been calling it cloning, because of the probably contractual obligations to the original. And down to the level of gestures, and also the production values, we were talking about that, actually probably indicate that there are some shots that are added. So you have a 2-shot and then go to close-up, etc., so that they follow probably the existing scripts, obviously changing that a little bit. But they also, of course, it's not cloning in the sense that there are a variety of formats. So this was a miniseries, 2 seasons of a miniseries. In South Korea, it was a long-running, I think 5 seasons, soap opera kind of 2.5-hour episodes. So there is a lot of adaptation that would indicate it's not really cloning. It's reformatting, maybe. That's better. It's reformatting. And that's another thing. These new fields like transmedia storytelling say, that's not adaptation, it's something different that we're doing. But what's actually being done is a lot of work into adapting, into overcoming boundaries. And the question, I think, is very much a translation question that came up earlier. What do you have to change in order to work for different audiences? And what do you hang on to? How's your obligation to the original? And I think the obligation is basically contractual. So you actually define what you can do and what you want to do. and then this is negotiated, and then you buy the format. But I don't know how much you're getting for it, and whether there's been any attempt to do Dr. Foster as a global clone without actually having the copyright. I don't know. I'm sure they're trying to sell it.
This is that word comment. Yeah, from a former grad student. She says, named Gladys, so she says, great lecture. I particularly enjoyed this last example of Dr. Foster across different cultures and how it translated the myth into distinct cultures and sets of values, yet with so much in common.
Yeah.
Could you please repeat a bit about the obligation?
Yeah, from what I know, what I found out, what's available is out publicly. And these are, of course, private negotiations, more or less private negotiations between the production companies. I found it interesting that sometimes, like in the case of India, BBC actively tries to sell the formats. We have Dr. Foster, have a look at it. Don't you think that this would work with audiences, your audiences as well? Do a remake, clone or reformat. And in other cases, like in France, someone was aware of the format and then directly approached the BBC. So we want to do that in our country. And then also what gets done very quickly and what gets done subsequently. But it's often the case in adaptation where you say, okay, this is an adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, the Jane Austen novel, when in fact what people are doing is they first take hold of all the existing other adaptations and they adapt these as well. So you don't accept an original text, but you adapt the entire universe. And so I think a lot of the adaptations that we see now are adaptations of The World is Married rather than Dr. Foster was taken into account. I don't know whether this actually translates into copyright fees to the South Korean production company. I don't know how this works, but be very interested to find out. It's a question I don't think this question.
What we can maintain the original of the several originals and what we can adapt into the course. I think the title of the several adaptations because none of them use Dr. Foster. I was thinking about the Korean adaptation and my little knowledge of Korean, and I think they could have perfectly used the title because Korean professions are not gendered. They could have used these double. So I think it's they take the part of the original is the infidelity and the marriage, and I think they run along with it and use it in the title and as their main focus.
The question was about how the titles indicate changes in the formula, maybe, or how the emphasis is different. And that's, my original idea was it works well in societies that where there's a lot of rupture and there's been a transition from very patriarchal societies to less patriarchal societies in a short time. And that's perfect. I shouldn't say that word perfect. It's so close, so I don't know. For instance, South Korean society, has within the span of 3 decades transformed from a very traditional society, very patriarchal, into a sort of more open. Actually, want to use these words. I don't know. Supposedly more open society, but so that something like that would be seen as controversial. Where I think in Germany it was received as yet another remarkable fidelity drama or something like standard fare, maybe even very traditional in its approach. I don't know enough about the various responses across cultures. I was thinking Turkey, Russia, South Korea, vast changes provoked by decades of globalization, but there's also a backlash to go back to more traditional formations, family formations. So in that situation, it seems to work very well, though. And I was wondering, why are there countries where there hasn't been states? You could see that in the States. You could see that in the States. No? Then what would you have to do then for it to work in the States? You know, for instance, the Philippine version, as I just showed you, there can be no abortion in the Philippines. You have to go to the States to have an abortion. So this needs to be, if that's part of this narrative, then you have to change that. And the good thing is, of course, and he has not out of copyright, and copyright what exactly? I mean, there's Euripides version, there's various other Greek versions, even different emphases. So you can take that and you map your own agenda on it. And I know that some theater directors these days, they use the Greek myth to nobilitate very controversial and provocative kind of scenarios. So they can actually say, yeah, there's a lot of fratricide and killing of children, etc. But it's Greek myth. These are the
Christian myths. They're also this kind of thing.
The anti-Christian, or
like the Bible.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah, it carries a lot of cultural prestige, but then that would be terrible to have for television audiences. I mean, no one will watch that thinking, "Oh, this is the Medea, with our new Medea." That would actually provoke the wrong kind of audience. You have to hide it. It's like so that's why I mean, Hutchins says it's only an adaptation if it's signposted as an adaptation, and then it's also received as an adaptation. I don't think audiences watch that and think, well, this is not true to Medea. This should be different. You kill the son. Why is it just one son? So something's wrong here. But that's not how audiences address that. Audiences think, and I know scenarios like that. I'm interested. Is she going to leave the house, but now we're going to go back together in some way? Kind of melodramatic family romance kind of thing.
Well, thank you, Mr. Voigts, for being with us here today. And thank you for the presence of all the students online and here with us. And
yes, thanks. It was such a pleasure to be able to. Thanks for this.
It's waiting for you online, okay? And we'll end the meeting right now. Thank you.